Okay, Heather and I are interviewing Mom. It's July 1st, 2012, about her family, and we're going to start to talk on the Enmeier side. And we were just looking at a wonderful booklet that Ray Enmeier put together that talks about the family tree and talks about Anna Tieck, who married Henry Enmeier in Germany and then came to the United States. And Mom, do you want to talk about their children?
They didn't get married in Germany, but they grew up in Germany and came to this country and then got married.
Okay, did they meet in Vincennes?
I think, well,
Or
probably Westphalia.
Okay.
That's a state in Germany, but it's the name of a town near Vincennes, where a lot of people came to flee the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War.
And then they had 9 children, including Paul Enmeier, who was then Heather and mine's great-great-grandfather, but also Lena, who ended up marrying a Buck, and we'll talk about the Bucks later, because they're people that you've spent a lot of time with. But tell us more about then. So Anna and Henry got married once they came to Indiana, and they lived in Westphalia, we think.
And they had a farm.
And
they raised 9 children, plus 2 of Lena's children, because she died in the Great Flu epidemic. She died in 1920. So 2 of her 4 children were raised on the farm, and 2 others were farmed out to other relatives.
Did you ever know them, Mom?
The Bucks? These are the Bucks. Lena Enmeier married a Buck. I know nothing of whatever happened to him. But anyway, so there were 11 children on the farm. And those 2, the Buck children, were grandchildren, and so was my father, who was an only child. So he became very close to his 2 first cousins, the Buck boys. And that's why they knew each other so well.
okay,
Did Grandpa spend time on the farm growing up?
Yes, because he lived in Bicknell, which was just right next door to Westphalia. That's where he grew up, and then later his parents moved to Vincennes.
so your Paul and Ruth, they farmed too?
No,
Just Henry.
my grandfather, it was pretty early to be going to college. He was born in 1892, so it would have been, around 1910 when he would have gone to Indiana University and became a teacher. And then later, he was the treasurer of, the Sunshine Mine in Bicknell, and that's where his leg was cut off in a mine accident at the knee, and so he had an artificial leg from the knee down. And later he became a bank president, and after that he was politically active, and he was the treasurer of Knox County, Indiana. And so I remember going with him to the courthouse to see his big office.
And what about Ruth?
He married Ruth French, who came from a family of 3 sisters, and I don't really know much about her. I'd love to get that on Ancestry or something. I mean, something about her family, but they were of French descent, and probably because it was Vincennes was a French fort, and so they come from somehow from that ancestry. And after my grandmother died, my grandfather married again after a few years, Ruth Jacquemin, and the Jacquemins were the founding family of Knox County. So there's a lot of French. There's a lot of French in my background. My grandmother was named Ruth French, and my step-grandmother is Ruth Jacquemin. So those very prominent French names.
So you didn't know your you didn't know your biological grandmother?
Yes, Ruth French. She died on my 10th birthday.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember Ruth Jacquemin marrying your grandfather?
Oh, heavens, yes.
To do? Scandal?
Because when my grandmother died, my father wanted my grandfather to come and live with us. And when he married somebody else, this was really a hard time for my father.
Yes, I bet, because losing his mother and...
Yeah. My mother was young when she died.
So what you said...
She was in her 50s.
Yeah, so if you were only 10, you were all living in Vincennes?
And she had been bedridden for many years, and we'd go every Sunday, spend every Sunday with her.
Do you remember or know what her illness was?
Yes.
Colon cancer?
Colon cancer.
Oh, really?
That's why because my mother, in other words, my paternal grandmother and my mother, so both sides of my family.
Right.
That's why,
It's
high
that,
risk.
yeah. Yes. I didn't know that. And so Paul married Ruth French, and then when you were 10, she passed away, so that must have been in the late 40s, 1949 or somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah.
And then they got remarried.
Yeah.
And
I don't have down when she remarried. When he remarried, but it was a few years.
And then on your mother's side, the Bixbys.
Yeah.
So they also lived in Indiana. And we know that their history goes back somewhere to the Revolutionary War.
I think it's my grandmother, but
On Marie
Willman, and they actually lived in Illinois, right across the river, in Mount Carmel, and her family all owned, like, the most famous jewelry shop in the area.
Oh,
China
yes.
and jewelry, and
Mm-hmm.
I think you guys have been there a couple of times, and they were all at my mother's funeral. And Jay Bixby and Marie Wildman had 4 children. My mother was the oldest, and she was born in 1912, so she would be 100, just like both of
Dad?
in other words, both of your grandmothers
Would be 100
would
this
have
year.
been 100 this year. Yeah.
Wow. And so the 4 children were Virginia,
Right.
No, her first name's not Virginia.
Dorothy,
Dorothy.
Virginia.
and who are the other 3 children?
Ella May, who was born in 1916, so 4 years after my mother. Then Jean was born in 1919. Jay Warren, otherwise known as Bud, from Florida, in 1929.
So, your mom's...
He was the real baby.
Your mom, Ella...
Ella May.
Ella May, she's the one who lived in Arizona, right?
Yes.
And Jean lived in Chicago.
No, Jean lived right there in Indianapolis.
And do you remember them growing up? Your aunts?
Oh, yes.
I know you remember your uncle.
Ella May lived in Vincennes and married a man who was in the Pacific War and contracted bronchiectasis, and that's why they had to go to Arizona from Vincennes.
For his lungs.
Because of his lungs.
He didn't live that much longer. I love Jean's husband, Ray. We got along very well. And
Do you remember what they did?
but Jean was just a total wacko religiously. I mean, she was just, and their daughter was young and was the flower girl in our wedding, but I haven't seen her since.
Since your wedding day.
Mm-hmm.
She was the littler girl, flower girl. I mean,
the only flower girl.
yeah.
But the son I've seen, he lives near Indianapolis, but not sure I have his address anymore. And Bud, Jay Warren, went to college at
University of Vincent.
Butler,
Oh,
and was a star of the football team.
but didn't you see him play when he was in high school too? Or we're too little.
Yeah.
But did you see him, saw him play in college?
I'm not sure. Let's see. Bud was born in 1929, so by the time I was born, he was 20.
Yeah, you wouldn't remember.
Yeah, so I would have been less than 5. Well, I would have been 1 to 5 when he was in college. Yeah.
And then, Mom, so, right, so your mother, Dorothy Virginia, then married James.
Right.
And do you know how they met? Or where they met, or remember any stories about them meeting?
You know, that's a really good question. But, trying to remember if they went to high school together. He lived in Bicknell, though, and she lived in Vincennes. So, I don't know how they met.
But so it wasn't like their families were friends or anything.
They were Presbyterians, and the Bixbys and the Enmeiers went to First Christian Church. So they wouldn't have
met through church.
they wouldn't have met each other at church. I don't think they're in here.
Well, once they got married, where did they live, Mom?
Once they got married, they lived in Indianapolis while my dad was in dental school. And when he graduated, he was drafted into the Army.
So that would have been sometime in the 40s? Oh no,
40,
you were
maybe.
already, yeah.
41, 40. I'm not sure how long it was that we moved from place to place, following him being on maneuvers with his company. But I do know that my sister was born in South Carolina. That was one of the places. And one of the places is in Tennessee.
Murfreesboro.
Oh, okay.
And I remember we had a wood stove. My mother cooked at a wood stove.
Wow.
So, but
Those are the only two places ever.
You were born in Vincennes.
Yeah.
And then was your dad in dental school then, or where was he in his journey?
Well, I was born 5 years after they were married, and he was he wasn't out. He was drafted from dental school,
So he was in the Army when you were born. He was drafted by the time you were born.
I don't think so. I don't think he was drafted for a year or so.
So after you were born, he was drafted. Okay. And then you immediately started moving around.
So he was in the Army when my sister was born, and he only saw her for 6 weeks, and he went off to war.
In 1942.
No, it was 39 or 40.
So he went over.
Oh no, Barbara was born when?
Do you have it written down there? It could be in the book. Pass me the book.
Barbara, 1941, I've got.
So if she was born in 1941, that's when he went to war. So he was early.
So what I'm confused about is that I thought he was in the Fourth Day Landing at Normandy. Was that fall of 41?
42.
Okay. So it still is making sense. I just hadn't put the dates down. So Barbara was born in November of 41. So by Christmas of that year, we were back in Vincennes, and we had a tiny little house, and we rented rooms to flyers who were stationed at Camp Atterbury.
Wow.
And I'm not sure how long we did that, but we didn't own a car. Gas was simply too expensive.
So this was during it. So your father was in Europe.
He was
And
in Europe
you were-
for the extent of the war, so he didn't come home till 45. So, but Barbara was born in November, so 42, 43, 44. He was gone 3 years. And she didn't know him at all when he came home. That
And
was
you
hard.
were living in Vincennes that whole time then?
Yeah.
And you spent a lot of time with your grandparents, right?
Yes.
Both sides?
Yes. And that's when I saw Ella May, and her husband was off at war, and it's quite a verdant valley, and we would can everything and sit around it in the summer sweating, canning fruit and vegetables. And we lived on Upper 11th Street in Vincennes. And when the war was over, my mother went to meet my dad's ship in New York and brought him home.
Did you stay with Grandma
I think she came and stayed with us. I think it was Grandma Bixby. And I was in the first grade, so I was 6.
And when did you get? Was it whooping cough that you got? You had to stay home in the dark.
That was in South Carolina.
So that was before.
I was just a baby then.
Oh, I thought there was time you had to stay home and you got so far in school you advanced a year.
Oh, there was a little tiny country store just a few blocks from us, and it had a rope swing.
No, that's when you broke your leg.
So it wasn't very far off the ground, but I was going like this on this rope, and when I fell, my leg fell under me. And so what it was a spiral fracture because of the impact, the way it hit, and so I couldn't wear a walking cast.
Were you in track? I mean, nowadays you would have been put in traction. How did they do it back then? Just cast you?
They totally I had cast all the way up, and my mother had to pull me in a wagon because we didn't have a car. So I can remember seeing Santa Claus at what would something be like today?
Like a Macy's, but
but it was like a huge hardware store. Anyway, that's where Santa was, and I can remember being pulled down there and talking to Santa.
with your broken leg.
That had to be. So I went to kindergarten, and then this happened in the first grade, and I stayed home several months in the first grade. And then I didn't go to the second grade.
Do you have any particular memories about Paul and either Ruth when you were little?
Well, totally. I went every Friday.
The first Ruth.
No, well,
The first Ruth was my natural grandmother, who died when I was 10. But see, I was there the whole time. I mean, I think we had just moved to Fort Knox the last year before she died. But before that, I saw her every Sunday, and every Friday I went and picked up the books she'd read, took them to the library, and picked up the next set that she wanted.
Because she was bedridden, so you did that for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't really ever remember her. When she wasn't in
a bed.
Day clothes. I mean, she wasn't in bed laying there or anything.
She was at home.
But she was at home.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a totally different world in terms of people who had disabling illnesses, I guess.
And what about with Jay and Marie? You see them every week too, or?
I don't know how often, but I remember gardening with my grandmother worked because my grandfather got tuberculosis before the war, and she had to put. He was an architect. He did a lot of the
buildings.
town halls throughout the state of Indiana. And you'd think that would have made him wealthy enough to last, but anyway, she worked in as a salesperson in a clothing shop. And that's what put food on the table through the war.
This is great-grandma Bixby.
Yeah. And I think that shaped a lot of... The other thing I remember is they had an ice box when I was like
with a
5 years
big
old.
Chunks, putting a big slab of ice
the
in.
Iceman cometh. He would come and bring, and blocks of ice were in sawdust. That was interesting. I can remember that.
See, I was getting your story mixed up with Dad, because I'm like, Dad, did you have an icebox, Grandma? He's like, no, we didn't have an icebox until Grandma got a refrigerator. I'm like, So getting my family members mixed up.
You were 9 when you moved to Knoxville then?
No.
No.
I mean, I must have been around 3 to 5 before my dad was shipped out. And he came back home when I was around 7.
Okay. But didn't you stay in Vincent's for a while, and then he went back into the Army?
First, second, and third grade, after he came home, we still were in Vincent's. And he went into private practice. And, I wasn't old enough to totally get it. But I don't think he could reconcile himself with people he knew that made money off the war. And he had just experienced too much death. Never talked about it. But anyway, it was hard.
So
he decided, as we approached Korea, they were trying to get doctors back in the Army, so doctors and dentists. They were offered twice the number of years toward retirement that they'd put in wartime, if they would come back regular Army. So he was one of the people who did, and we only moved 2 hours away. What could be nicer?
Where'd you move?
To Fort Knox, which is
okay.
Louisville, Kentucky. About 2.5 hours from Vincennes. Might be less than that now. The roads were kind of like that. I used to get terribly carsick. We were there, and I was there 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, so that was a long time.
So during those times, did you go back on weekends to visit your grandparents?
It wasn't like every weekend, but we went back quite a bit, actually.
Or probably all the holidays.
Yeah.
So then after Knoxville, where'd you go?
After Knoxville? I don't know why we're talking about Knoxville.
I'm sorry, Fort Knox.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. Got my Knoxes up.
Yeah, to Fort Knox.
We were at Fort Knox, and then the Korean War started, and that had nothing to do with going overseas, I guess. But everybody was very worried it was going to be the Third World War, and we went to Washington, D.C. for 6 months while my father took an advanced surgery course. And then we were shipped to Germany in December of, in other words, the middle of the 7th grade.
Which would have been what year? Can you think that?
It would have been, well, we started on the trek at the end of 49 and got there January 50.
So it had been 5 years since Grandpa was in Germany.
So we went right back to Germany for 4 more years. And my father was very instrumental in working on health issues in Germany, and because tuberculosis was rampant, and he helped get the new dental society going, and there was a lot of cross-medical teams, like for inspections and testing of milk. We couldn't drink the milk for the first year or 2. We had to drink powdered milk. That was the most awful thing about going to Germany.
With the powdered milk.
But we didn't
Very
see
good.
anybody in the family for 4 years.
No.
People did not have
Right,
the money
did
to
not
travel.
Right.
We didn't have the money. Nobody did.
Right.
But you wrote, I assume, back and forth.
We did.
What about your your parents speaking German? Did they spoke German when they were in Vincennes, or did they all have to learn?
My
it in
mother
German?
didn't grow up in a German family. Remember, it was Scotch, Irish, and French.
Oh, okay, so
Now, my father's family, I don't remember him ever speaking German, but his family from Westphalia, we had a great aunt named Riki Teek. So part of the Teek. Aunt Riki, Rikki. She really never spoke English. I met her when she was in college. My grandfather took me to see her, and during the First World War, she would not believe that the Kaiser could be at fault of anything, and they kept all the German services going in the church. Finally, in the Second World War, it was, they stopped the German service because everybody was very
Probably worried too. I mean, it was
anxious about anybody who spoke German.
So we're going to take a minute break.
okay.